Alright, what's up nerds? This is Cam. Over the next few videos, I'm going to be working on a inventory system. I'm going to be building on top of my weapon system that I created in an earlier series. If you just want to start from this video though, that should be fine. The only thing that we really used from the last series is the input controls and the framework for my mixins. So if you're curious about the mixins and how they work together, you might want to go back to the first video where I developed the framework, and then you should be good to start here. And the input controller, I'll show you it in this video, and it's relatively simple, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. That being said, this project's going to be up on GitHub, so if you haven't seen the earlier videos but want to check some of the code, you can always just clone it and see what's going on there. I'm just going to give you a quick sneak peek of what we're going to be working towards over the next few videos. So if you look in the bottom left here, when I pick up my items, it displays them with a little thumbnail for kind of showing what's in your inventory, and it dynamically places them. So weapons fall on the left inventory and items fall into the right inventory. And then I can equip them by dragging them onto these equip slots. So the bottom two slots are my hands, so dragging it here has equipped my weapon to my left hand, and if I drag my shield here, it equips it to my right hand, and then when I drag my helmet up on top, it equips it to my head, and then it places that object in like equip locations on my character. So I hope you enjoy the series. If you have any feedback or questions, feel free to shoot me a comment. Okay, so I'm just going to get started, and I'm going to grab my two rifles, and I'm going to drag them outside of my player object so they're no longer children. And then I'm just going to move them forward just so that you guys can see what's going on when I press fire here. Both rifles are listening at the same time. So when I hold down my mouse button, both rifles are firing, and that's not what we want. So we're going to fix that to start. One thing I've done here is I've created a bool data script, and all it has is a bool and a get data and a set data function. So that's relatively simple, but we're going to use it to check if our input classes are listening. Because the way we have it working right now is that it's listening and update, so it's always running. And we're going to put that in, we're going to give that a check here. So in our input base, we can put our check there. And since this is a mixin, we can use our overrideable check function that we already have, and then what we can return is a bool data. So we can put a bool data in here, and we'll call this is listening, and then we're just going to return is listening's data type here. So return is listening get data, and then for our action is going to do what we were doing before in our update when we heard our key. So that's going to call our input action, which is our reference mixin that we want to call when we hear this thing, this key. So now we have to call our action when we hear the key, but first we're going to check it. So we have a simple way to do that already set up, and it's just going to be check and action. So now when we hear this input key, we're going to call check and action on ourself, which calls check. If this returns true, then it will call action, which will call our input action, which is just this mixin base here that we've referenced. So that should work fine. So if we pop onto our rifles, now our input scripts here have a bool data. So then we can give this bool data, and this is going to be our is listening, and we'll reference it to our fire types here. So now when I press play and click the mouse, neither of my rifles are going to fire because this bool data is set to false. If I check this, then one rifle will fire here. I can uncheck this and turn it on my other one, and the rifle will fire fine on the right. So that's working perfectly. So that's nice. So now what we're going to do is we're going to equip these rifles, and when we equip a rifle, it's going to turn its bool data on. Okay, so to accomplish this, I'm going to add some logic to my rifle here. So I'm going to create a new game object, and I'm going to call it equip logic. And I'm just going to turn off my other rifle for now, just so we're working with one. And on equip logic, I'm going to give it a box collider. And the box collider is going to be a trigger. And essentially what I'm trying to say is that when the player is within this trigger, then my object is interactable. So then it can be picked up. But the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create an interactable class, and then I can put that on any any object in my scene that I want the player to be able to interact with, and then giving it different inputs and mix-in responses, he'll be able to interact with each object differently. So I'll start by making the interactable class, and I just have a folder here called equip mixins, so I'm just going to go and create it in there, and I'll call it interactable. And if I open my interactable class here, so what I want to do is I'm going to make it a mixin base, but we're not going to use our check action functions here for now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a set active function here. And set active is going to set a bool data for us. So we'll call this is interactable. Interactable. And well, what we're going to set it with is the parameter that we listen for here. So we'll say we'll get a bool, and we'll set this here to be this bool. And then what we want to do is we want to call set active from our player controller. So if we pop into our player controller, we're basically listening for a trigger enter, trying to see if it's interactable, and then setting that bool accordingly. So if we say on trigger enter here and listen for the collision or the collider, then we can say we're going to get a component from it, and the component we're listening for is interactable. So we can actually set, we'll just make a temporary variable here. So now if there is a interactable component on the trigger volume that we've entered, this if statement will return true, and then we can set the interactable object to be active. So we'll say interactable, set active, and true. And then what we need after that is a very similar function, but it's going to set it false when we leave the trigger. So we can say on trigger exit, same thing if there is an interactable object on it, except we're going to set it to false. So if we pop back here onto our equip logic, we'll give this interactable, and we'll give it a bool data. And interactable has to compile here. Oh no, this has to be public. So yeah, so we want it to be public so we can reference it in our inspector. And then we can just reference our bool data onto our interactable here. And then when our player moves in and out, you can see our bool data gets set to be true and false. So what we're going to do is we're going to put an input on here, and that input will listen from this bool data. So we can say get key down input, and our get key down input is going to be listening when this bool data is true. So then we can say what key we want to be our pickup action. So then we can say, let's use space. So we can say when the space key is pressed, if this bool is true, so if the player is touching the rifle, we're going to call a mixin that we want to equip this rifle. And for now, I'll just write something simple. So we can write, let's say equipable. So equipable is going to set our able to fire bool to be true. So we need a bool data, and we'll call this is equipped. And then we need this to be a mixin, and we need our action. Oh, sorry, that's an override. So what we're saying here is when this equip function is called, when the action is called on equipable, we're going to set the bool data that we've referenced to be true. So it's relatively a simple class here, but what we can do is our bool that's listening for our fire press is this bool data here on the parent object. So if we set this to public again, then we can reference it in the inspector. So we'll drag our parent object onto our bool data, and then we'll drag equipable onto our input action. So when space is pressed, while the is interactable bool is true, then equipable will be called, which will set our bool data here to be true, which means that we can now fire our weapon. So if we hit play here, we can walk into this trigger volume and hit space, which is going to turn on our input bool here, and now we can fire our rifle. But if I show you, if I pop in here and fire my rifle before I equip it, it doesn't work. So that's working great. So what we can do now is we can actually, when we pick this weapon up, instead of just automatically turning the fire logic on, we can put it into an inventory, and then when we actually pull this weapon out, we'll turn that bool on. But just keep it simple here. You have it turning on and off simply just by popping into this trigger volume, which is great. So the other thing, I just wanted to show off a bit of the modularity of this system. So I created this door, and this door here is very simple. It just has a animator on it, and if I click play here, when I trigger open here, the door opens, and that's all it does. There's no logic on it right now, but I can use the same logic from my interactable pickup system to interact with this door. So if I'm just going to create an empty game object, and I'm going to call it open logic. And open logic, I'm going to give a box collider, and it's going to be a trigger. And I'm just going to move it out here. And then all I have to do here is the same deal. I'm going to give it interactable, and a bool data, sorry. So this bool data will be true when my player is within this trigger volume. And then I can give it a input key. So we'll do get key down. And for get key down, so I'll use the E key just as an interaction button. And then for my input action, I'm going to do set trigger, trigger animator, which is an old mixin that we've written. And I'm going to put trigger animator in as our input action. And for my is listening bool, I'm going to put the is interactable bool here. And then I'm just going to reference the animator from the mesh. And now, without writing any code, just using the same mixins we've used from our weapon and inventory system, I can walk into this trigger, which is going to set this bool to be true. I'm going to click E. Oh, my bad. I didn't set the trigger name, so I'm just going to pop out of play, and I'm going to write open there, and now it will work. So I can walk into this trigger volume and click E, and my door opens. So that's kind of where you get the really the modularity of this system, is that just using that same logic, you can equip this weapon and fire it, or you can open this door, which is great. So then any interactable object in your scene, it can do anything that you want. You just have to use this interactable class with an input key and a bool. Which is great. So I hope you enjoyed it. In the next couple videos, I'll equip this rifle, I'll put it in an inventory, we'll get some UI going for it. It's gonna look really nice. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.